This jack was first introduced by BMW alongside the E21 and was then sold with the E30 when it was released 7 years later. So to get started, I'm going to strip it down as far as possible and get to work on removing that rust. With the thread now out, the only pieces left are the arm that attaches to the car and moves up and down, and the rubber stop at the bottom. To my surprise, both of those are trapped inside the neck of the jack. BMW must have welded these together and then painted them, which makes sense as the rubber stopper has old paint on it. So with this in mind and my newfound love for welding, I've decided to chop the head off and re-weld it back on later. I started by using this tiny cutting disc to try and minimise the size of the cut, but quickly moved on to a grinder as life is just a bit too short not to. This made light work of it. Now I can slide these out and take a good look at all of the parts. I think this is some 30-year-old grease mixed with some 30-year-old dirt. Not the best for lubrication. And as for the ball bearings, there's not a lot of grease to be seen here either. So first things first, I need to clean everything in the parts washer and then dry them fully so none of the shot blasting media gets stuck inside. I'm using a medium grade glass media, which is good for removing severe rust, paint, and also leaves a uniform keyed surface. With that done, you can really see the pitting on the bottom compared to the surface rust everywhere else. Because my plan is to rebuild this before I paint it, just like BMW did, I'm going to prepare the internal parts now so they're ready to go in. I really don't get how rust attaches itself to rubber like this, but I find a wire wheel removes it nicely. This plastic cover has old paint all over it, so I'm going to strip that off in preparation for the new stuff. Now, I could use that technique for whitening yellowed plastic like this, but as it's going inside a jack and will never be seen, I can live happily knowing that they're slightly yellow. Because some of the lifting arm is going to be inside the neck when it's painted, I'm going to paint just that part now so it's protected like the rest of it. I'm only giving it 2 lights of primer and base coat because if the paint's too thick, it won't slide easily in the neck. With that done, I've now realised that the rubber stopper will also get in the way of a proper paint job. So to overcome this, I'm going to quickly prime and base coat only where the stopper sits and then install it along with the arm. So now the necessary bits are painted and clean, I can put these back together and get the head welded back on. A bit of tidying up is needed before the cutting disc will sit flush and give me the gap I need. Using the same thickness cutting disc, I can see where the head needs to sit and hold it there whilst I weld it on. I'm quite happy with how similar these welds look to the original, although as this is actually going to be used to jack up my car, I'm going to weld around the entire thing and grind it back to strengthen it, but also keep it looking original. With the head completely welded, I'm using a die grinding bit to smooth everything out apart from the original welds. I'm now moving on to a finger sander to finish it off. Moving on to the bottom of the jack, where the rust is the worst, I'm going to sort that out with some U-Pole Fantastic Filler. Now that's dry, I can sand it down with 80 grit sandpaper and finish it off with some 300 grit sanding pads. So with all of that prep done, I can finally start the compressor and paint this thing for real. I let that dry for about 20 minutes, and now I'm going to apply 2 coats of quartz high build primer that I'll bake for 20 minutes at 60 degrees. Now the primer has cured, I can sand it back in preparation for the base coat and clear. And just like before, I gave it a quick tack cloth before applying 2 coats of base coat. Because I want the matte look but don't have any matte lacquer in a tin, I'm using a high coat can, as I find their paint to be quite good. Leaving that to completely dry under the infrared lamp, I can move on to cleaning up the rest of the small bits as well as the main thread. The thread and the bearings are cleaning up really nicely, but the plastic and rubber covers still have old paint on them. I'm using paint stripper to remove it, and will refinish them in a textured plastic paint. This cover was cracked along a few of its edges. To fix this, I'm using a soldering iron and some ABS filament to fill in the cracks and smooth out the bad bits. Before I go any further, I'm sanding down the old and new plastic so there aren't any high spots, and also going over all of the letters to make sure they're as they should be. The final step for this cover is some plastic filler to fill in any dents made by the repairs. Whilst all of that was going on, the paint stripper was doing its thing on this rubber piece. I can now paint both of them with what is officially a textured bumper paint, but I find it's perfect for plastic and rubber pieces like this. With the metal part of the handle finished, I need to swap the masking tape over and finish the plastic piece with the same paint. In hindsight, I might repaint this piece with clear coat for a shiny finish, as I think that's what it was meant to be before. But there we go, everything restored, partly back together again, and ready to be finished and tested. The grease I'm using to rebuild this is of course my favourite Zepp Pro Lube. The main thread and the ball bearings are getting a good helping to keep it moving smoothly for another 30 years. The main thread can now be installed back in with an equally painful amount of twisting as it took to get out. The only thing left to do now is add these pieces back in and it'll be done. Easy as that, right? Well no, I made a stupid mistake of putting this piece in backwards after I convinced myself this is how it went. I even welded it in, thinking to myself how well this is all going. I then greased it up, gave it a test and installed the two covers. It was only at this point that I decided to double check the footage to make sure I'd made the right decision. Immediately, I saw it was wrong and had to relive the start of this episode all over again. With that piece now on the right side, I welded it in place for the final time and refitted the covers. And there we go, fully restored and looking like it just came out of the factory. The last thing to do is give it a test on a fully fitted E30. It's honestly the smoothest E30 jack I've ever used. I highly recommend doing this to anyone who's got the tools, time and want to do it. A stiff jack is never fun. I think I'll keep the piece of rubber and cloth with the jack to prolong its life and keep it looking nice, as sad as that is. So that's all for this one. I really am excited to start working on the 325i Sport again, and once the Mercedes is done, the Red Touring will also be back with regular updates. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.